Hello and welcome to a Guerrilla History and the Red Menace crossover episode. I'm Henry Huckamacky, one of the co-hosts of Guerrilla History, and I'm joined by the wonderful Alyson Escalante of the Red Menace podcast. Now, we're sister podcasts affiliated with the Revolutionary Left radio kind of network of shows, and so since this is a crossover episode, we'll briefly introduce ourselves just so that listeners of the Red Menace who haven't listened to Guerrilla History know a bit about me, and people that listen to Guerrilla History that don't listen to the Red Menace, but should, I might add, know a little bit about Alyson. So I'm Henry Huckamacky. I'm an immunobiology graduate researcher. And as I said, I co-host the Guerrilla History podcast with Professor Adnan Hussein and Brett O'Shea. We're a proletarian history podcast, and we cover global history. I think that if you are a regular listener of the Red Menace podcast, it will be an interesting podcast for you because we take much the same viewpoint on issues, but with focus on proletarian history, as I said. Alyson?
Hi, yeah, so I'm Alyson. Like Henry said, I am one of the co-hosts on Red Menace podcast with Brett O'Shea. On our podcast, we mostly take texts of revolutionary theory and try to break them down with a pretty intense textual focus, quoting at length and also trying to do summary work for readers to kind of act as a companion to reading the text and help people a little bit, and also to think about what those texts might mean and suggest for us today in organizational work, not just as abstract ideas, but in terms of implementing them in the world in some way or another. So yeah, that's kind of what we do over there. Again, I think there's some interesting overlap in what we do in Guerrilla History, so hopefully you can check out and enjoy both of them, and I'm very excited for this crossover episode.
Absolutely, and I've been a fan of Alyson's for as soon as she first went on to Rev Left Radio for the first time, so it's a pleasure to finally meet you, Alyson. Now, we're joined today by a very special guest who has a very special book out recently. We're joined by Françoise Vergès, who is an activist and public educator and the author of the new book, pretty new, A Decolonial Feminism, out from Pluto Press. Hello, Françoise. How are you doing today?
Hello, I'm fine. And you?
I couldn't be better. Well, I have a bit of a fever today, but other than that, I couldn't be better. I'm very happy to talk with you. So why don't I open up the conversation by just having you lay out the central thesis of your work, A Decolonial Feminism. Let us know about what your vision for a decolonial feminism is briefly, and maybe also add in a little bit about how your background coming up on Reunion Island kind of shaped that worldview. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically after that.
Well, thank you. And thank you, for inviting me. And I'm very glad to talk to two, hosts that absolutely very clearly identify themselves with the revolutionary left. Because this is also where I situate decolonial feminism as radically anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist. That's very important also for me, the anti-imperialism. And so very also radically as the goal is transforming deeply the society and the world in which we live. And so it's not a feminism of equality or just parity, let's say, but really of the deep transformation. And the book start with a strike of women, who they were cleaning a railway station in France, but they could have cleaned a railway station anywhere in the world, or, some hospital or university. It was, taking again the feminism from really the woman made the most vulnerable, the most precarious by, capitalism and racism. All women are, are women of Black women of color. And so the decolonial feminism was to start to say, okay, let's look again, where the struggle is, the struggle of, with the radical feminism. And we will start from the women who are cleaning the world. And for me, the fact that the society will not function, the patriarchal capitalist racist society will not function without their daily work. The fact that then, the guy, the banker can go to the office and drop their kids at the, daycare, and then go to the gym or to the restaurant or whatever. All the world has been cleaned so that they can, and their wives are there. So how the comfort of a few rests on the exploitation and exhaustion of the many and the many being mostly women of color. So that was, the starting point, and also the need to reappropriate feminism, to take it from the end of, because everyone can be a feminist today, is no longer so, even the far right. So this is, the army can be feminist, anyone can be feminist. So no, to have to redefine feminism. I mean, they can call themselves feminism, of course. I mean, but the point that there is a feminism that has a history. I mean, there are feminisms that are history and connected with radical liberation, radical revolution in the global south and elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful summary. So I really loved this text, honestly. I think one thing that you really get at is connecting sort of these perspectives also to the actions that are being taken by decolonial feminists in the world today, right? Which is always what I am impressed to see in theoretical works that are connecting to things grounded. So before we get into that a little bit, I was wondering if I could maybe, for the sake of our readers, bring up sort of a theoretical distinction that you make that I think is very useful, but that some people might not be familiar with, that I found very helpful in your text, which is that you bring up a distinction between colonialism and colonization, right? So these two distinct things wherein one is a process and the other is an event. And this is an idea that I think in the United States people have been starting to think with as sort of critiques of settler colonialism have become more popular. And the idea that there's an ongoing process, not just a past event, but a continual occupation and ideology which accompanies that. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what that distinction is for our readers, because I think it's very helpful for understanding what a decolonial feminism means in the 21st century in particular.
Yeah, I do think that, that there is at the heart of capitalism on its, regime of dispossession, spoliation, exploitation, the need to colonize. I mean, to find new ways, new place to exploit and, to deploy extractivism. This place can be, like place, concrete place, but also bodies, like new bodies to exploit, new, like even the deep sea. Everywhere, there is no place that can escape. And that has not ended with independence and construction of new nation state and the dismantling of the big colonial European colonial empire. This is continuing. So there is something that of the colony that remains really deeply at the heart of racial capitalism. There is no possibility. So the decolonial position is really to put an end to that, to that really art. And of course, that will dismantle capitalism and patriarchy and racism. But as you say, the kind of illusion that something ended with independence, with the end of the colonial administrative status is very important to show. And as you say, if we look at North America, the way indigenous people are, still, I mean, their situation, their position, or if it's a Black community or any kind of a community. And if we look at Central and South America, this would be also, we do see that something remain, and that there is, and that art, I mean, this foundation, which really rests on racism and exploitation and extraction, has to be really dismantled if we want to dismantle, like the regime of murder in which we live.
So I have a pretty big question here, so I'll leave it open so you can take it however you want to. We're talking about colonialism, coloniality, and now I want to shift that to how feminism ties into this. So we have many forms of feminism. As I understand it, you didn't consider yourself a feminist for many, many years because of all of these very disparate tendencies within the feminist realm. And you really didn't affiliate yourself with many of them. A lot of them have severe problems, let's say. So I guess here's a few of the threads that I'm just going to put out there. And then, as I said, you can take it however you want. One thing that really carries through this work, and something that I had not really thought about in a conceptual way, I had understood it in individual events, is civilizational feminism. So that's something that, of course, you carry through here. And I would love if you could talk about civilizational feminism, what it is, because as I said, you'd see things like the banning of the niqab, or you'd see all kinds of instances like this where we have civilized countries, as they would construe themselves, trying to impose their virtues on other nations. And at the same time, we have other tendencies like femo-nationalism, femo-imperialism. I have a quote from your book here, which I think also might help tie some of these threads together, which is, you say, the rise of reactionaries of all kinds shows one thing loud and clear: a feminism that fights only for gender equality and refuses to see how integration leaves racialized women at the mercy of brutality, violence, rape, and murder is ultimately complicit in it. So I know I put a lot of threads out there, and I'm hoping that you find a way to kind of thread some of those together. But can you tell us about civilizational feminism and some of these tendencies and how you wanted to break free from those in your conception of feminism?
Yeah. Well, as you were saying at the beginning, I am from Réunion Island, which was, a French colony of slave, and now it's still a French territory, overseas territory. I mean, the French states still have a lot of territories around the world, and so it's still a colonial state in the sense of what we defined at the beginning. So within that, of course, very few feminists in Europe were really against slavery, colonial slavery. And very few feminists were against colonization. Very few. Especially for colonization, they really deeply thought that this will bring, progress to the woman in this colony. But their voices were not that important. They were not very powerful at the time, 19th century, 20th century. But what I noticed in the 21st century, that really that civilization and feminism came back very strongly. I mean, we noticed it when the United States launched the war against Afghanistan. Part of it was like to save the Afghan woman, right? Suddenly it became important. Suddenly the woman appear, the woman in the South appear as helpless, victim of terrible patriarchy, terrible, culture. And so the United States will go to save them. So the white savior complex was, in fact, feminists adopted it very much. And the civilizing mission, which was really at the heart of the French colonial empire, and even though with another name in the British Empire, was really the fact that you're going to save these people who are victims. So you put yourself in colonization is a good deed. When you do that, you put yourself as a good person. You're doing a good thing. You're going to go there, or even in your country with women who are veiled and, the Muslim women, and you're going to save them. As if effectively the question of feminism, the country, the North, has been the natural ground, the natural soil on which, feminism emerged. As the two were connected. It was the birthplace of feminism. And so that one thing. And so I underline that, of course, a lot of women in the North in Europe had very few rights, very few civic rights until the 20th century. But they had one. As soon as, Europe started to colonize, they had the right to own human being. And this is a right that gave them, white supremacy gave them the right and not gender. So even if you look at the history of rights and the history of feminism, of bourgeois white feminism, it has the narrative about it is a narrative that exclude very important chapter in the understanding of rights. What are women's rights? But upon this understanding, they will say, these are the women's rights. This is what women deserve. This is women's emancipation and liberation. And these women don't understand it. And we have to tell them what to do. And this is absolutely why feminism, that kind of feminism, can be, in fact, adopted by a lot of government and on the international level also, because, in fact, it gave a very strong argument to the West, to the imperialist West, that, that the kind of other civilizing mission we're following, that they could not do it anymore, like we're going to build bridge and hospital, nobody, care about that. But if you were saying women's right, that touched very deeply, and in fact, a certain narcissism in the North, like we have this, we know what to do. And this became one of the best arguments that these feminists offer to imperialism. Here, you no longer have a very strong, discourse speech that is very convincing. This one going to be good. And we saw it with Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it everywhere. And we saw it, as you say, Henry, with, all this obsession with the veil or the niqab among, white feminists. So there was, what they could, the argument could have been, they could have made the argument and this would have been remained marginal. But what I argue is that it offers a very strong argument to imperialism, because who is against women's rights? Who can say, oh, yes, I am from a little girl being married. I am, no, it's kind of, so it was very good, very strong. And so certainly feminism got a very good, media. They were interviewed, they could be interviewed, their books could be sold, because they offer to neoliberalism and to imperialism the very best argument that even business, could have, that we are for equality, that we are for inclusion and diversity, and this will be good. And then outside, we will save this woman from, the worst patriarchy, because the culture over there, all this culture are, in fact, all sexist culture and patriarchal. But we have progress. Look, we have women in the army, we have women pilots, we have, so it was very interesting to try to understand how this happened and why it became so popular. Suddenly it became, you start to hear it, in the global places, the foundation, the big foundation, they are always, equality, women's right, in their program. So it has become common sense. And so it's a way of naturalizing imperialism and neoliberalism.
So as a potential follow-up to that, because I think this is, it really rings home growing up during the beginnings of the War on Terror in the United States, right? We saw these invocations from the Bush regime about human rights in Afghanistan in particular, I think you point out quite correctly. But one interesting thing about at least the domestic ideology here for how that was articulated was that it was very religious in orientation, right? American nationalism tends to have this very religious ring to it. But there's sort of more of a distinct ideology in France, right, where you have the notion of secularism or laïcité that functions, outside of that. And so I was wondering if for our listeners who might not be so familiar with that concept of secularism, you could talk a little bit about how secularism has played into this concept of civilizational feminism. I think it's complicated for the left in some ways because the left has been very critical of religion, and you will often hear talking points that almost mirror those talking points about Islam, for example. So how does secularism fit into this question, and how might we on the revolutionary left navigate this?
Yeah, the way in which secularism has become a weapon, has been weaponized in France by feminists and by the state, the bourgeois state, is really, in fact, a transformation of what was secularism at the beginning, which was you can, have your religion, but the state cannot be religious. The state cannot have a religion. So that was, in fact, very progressive. Now, secularism is against religion. Secularism become a religion of the state, become a state religion that in fact target Muslim very clearly. Nothing, like no other thing. It's Islam, which is really the target. So there is also, through that, a form, if in the United States it's a form of religious nationalism, but which still, go to the church to further that. In France, it's the state, it's the religion almost of the state, because it's becoming very hegemonic. So the state decide, what can be done or not done in public, which should not be, the state question. And so the intervention. But it's the fact that it's Islamophobic is very important. It's really Islam which is targeted. That's so clearly. And the feminists, whether in Germany, in France or in England, have been at the forefront, and they, in fact, provided the argument for Islamophobia by saying that the veil could be only the sign, the symbol of woman subjugation. That was nothing else. A woman could not choose herself. Muslim women could not be agent. They had no agency. And that had a very strong echoes because then it was put side by side with what was happening in Afghanistan or in, in Iraq or elsewhere. At a moment of Western government also supporting Saudi Arabia, right, and selling a lot of weapons. So we do see also, that how imperialism also play within that, So this, but one thing that you say, Alyson, that I think it will be interesting to also perhaps really reflect on when you say the war on terror,
right.
and how we are living in a permanent state of war, like now, war on drug, war on terror,
right.
war on the virus, war on everything, right? So this permanent state of war is also in the feminist field, in that bourgeois white feminism, has been, through a certain analysis of the rape and violence that is seen through that lens of civilization, civilizing men who must be civilized, and supporting then the police state and the prison as a solution, throughout. And so it's not an analysis of the structural systemic violence that this permanent state of war has absolutely normalized, banalized, weaponized, but it's remained, like through some men are brutal and they should be, taken out of society to protect women. And that question of protection today, which is so important, and that goes also to the question that you say, how, to protect women from themselves and from the men, who are their father and brother. And so the state now has totally captured the idea of protection, and that we have to accept to be protected by the state, as women, because otherwise we are. And so, but of course, the state imposes the condition of protection. And so you have to live by this condition and these norms to be protected. Otherwise, you are unprotected. And if you are unprotected, anything can happen to you. You can be beaten, put in jail, stripped of your rights, persecuted, humiliated. This is so. It goes also, your question with a question of protection, a certain return of patriarchy through the question of protection of women and children or the powerless. But it's totally depoliticized the question of protection. And because we see also with the pandemic that the most vulnerable and the people who have been led, to die are still the people, racialized, and the poor people.
So to follow up on still keeping the thread of civilizational feminism going, so people on the left-ish that are not members of the revolutionary left tend to uphold the French model of feminism because women have time off from work when they're maternity leave, they have childcare, etc. And a lot of social democrats and the like, progressives in the US particularly, look at that system that France has and compare it to the US, where we have no protections in place or no even remotely feminist appearing policies in place. And they think that France is this enlightened society, they're very feminist. And the revolutionary left, of course, does not go along with this view whatsoever, and including because in France, the protections for women during their maternity period, during the child rearing years, is to allow women into the professional sphere. It's to allow women to have advancement. But at whose expense? It's the white women disproportionately, and you point this out in your book, it's the white women in France disproportionately who are benefiting from these policies because it is the racialized women who are upholding these systems through the childcare work, through other associated work. So really, it's the racialized women that are upholding the ability of the white women in France to achieve professional success. I was just wondering if you could speak to how this is construed in France, how French people view this. I'm assuming they don't think about the racialized women who are upholding the role of white women in society, and how we should analyze this.
Yeah, indeed. And, in a former book, Also, I look at the fact that the French state, in the 1970s was, criminalizing abortion and contraception, and at the same time, in a French department, Réunion Island, absolutely, encouraging thousands of abortion without consent and sterilization. So the fact of who in the 1970s who had the right to give birth and who did not have the right to give birth was racialized. So in fact, even the battle, for abortion and contraception, if the feminists in France had reflected on that, they would have seen that it was not just, like the universal as all women will be on the same plane. And so this question and what you are saying, maternity leave and all this, we also won because of struggle by the working class, right? Mostly it was the working class who fought, not the bourgeoisie. But the things have changed, of course. More women now who are, 80% of part-time workers are women in France, right? 80% of cleaning are Black women. So women in these precarious, very low-paid, underqualified jobs cannot have access to. I mean, this effectively this social right. They do not work for them, because they don't even have, enough money to survive. I mean, what women are earning is incredible. It's like 900 euro per month, right? It's practically, it's not much in France. And so within that, effectively, first, you have an erasure of the fact that you had to fight for this right. It was never the state that gave them. And second, that more and more, as effectively there are structural change within capital, right? And capital, making life more precarious. The comfortable life of white bourgeois women is upon the back, if I may say, really, of racialized women. And so this goes with also a certain economy of what, I call it an economy of exhaustion of the body, because this woman, I mean, the women who work as cleaner or as, nannies for the kids of white family or taking care of the elderly and everything, they tell me that, they are absolutely, their body, I mean, the pain, the suffering, and some of them are barely in their 50s, they have already 3 surgeries, for their knees and everything. So there is also the fact that the white woman can go to the yoga or meditation or, jogging and be healthy and eat well is possible because the body of another woman is exhausted, cannot eat well because she doesn't have, has to make 2 hours of transportation to come to a job, going back to a place where you don't have park for her children, no place, and so on. So there is also it's not just the exploitation, it's also the way the life of the racialized woman, of the woman who is making that life possible. All the environment of her life is hostile to a good health and to a good, not just the physical, but also the psychic health. So yes, there is a fabrication, especially now, and we see it also in North America, health, being in good health, what you have to do, eat well, your avocado toast and do this and so on. This good life, this good taking care of your body and taking care of your mind and do meditation and so on, is absolutely all this construction and all these places, all these self-help things for your good is made possible because other bodies are then exhausted and do not have access to all this. So there is really effectively, as you say, the construction of comfort and the good life made on the invisibilization of so many exploited, because it's not just the nanny and the cleaning lady, it's also the woman in Bangladesh who are, doing the fast fashion so she can, this bourgeois woman in Europe can go and change clothes, buy clothes every 2 weeks that are different. It's also the people in the plantation somewhere who sell, the avocado that will be good for a body. Is so her life, her good life, rests on an incredible, network of exploitation and dispossession.
Yeah, so I think this notion of invisibilization is very, very useful, right? And part of the difficulty, I think, from the decolonial feminist perspective is that when we're trying to make these things visible, and I think you get at this very clearly, we're trying to look at these sites that aren't the product of just one contradiction, right? There are many, many contradictions at play from capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and various ideologies kind of piled on top of that. So maybe going to think about how decolonial feminism tackles this a little bit, I'm sort of interested in kind of the method that you develop here. So in the first half of the book, when you're really kind of developing a lot of these ideas, you say, quote, decolonial feminism is a feminism that offers a multi-dimensional analysis of oppression and refuses to divide race, sexuality, and class into mutually exclusive categories, end quote. And then you kind of state that the goal, right, is to hold these several threads at the same time. And again, this idea of multidimensional analysis, I believe as you present it, kind of moving beyond some of the ideas of intersectionality to something more developed in a certain sense. So what I'm curious about is when we're taking this multidimensional approach, right, how do we hold these various contradictions in relation to each other? So again, not seeing them as totally separate, but is that to deny the primacy of certain contradictions, or is it to place all of them on an equal footing? How methodologically do we approach social contradictions in this sense, especially in a time when capitalism, is often viewed as a totalizing ideology, right? Is that at odds with this multidimensional approach, or are those reconcilable in some way?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say that the multidimensional things for me is that effectively to be aware that, patriarchy, capitalism, racism does not work in one way, right? That's one thing. The second thing is also the way in which our lives are constructed, for the racialized or for, made vulnerable, is that the past is still there. I mean, we live in entangled temporality. A past is still not repaired, right? I mean, land being wasted, okay. A present that is being destroyed under our eyes, right? That is very affected and a future that would maybe not be possible if this go on like that. That there would be perhaps no future generation. So this entangled temporality have to work also through this different thread, right? So, but at the same time, as you were asking, I would say it's within the context. There sometimes you find there is an enemy here, right? So you cannot say, oh, there was an enemy, but perhaps there was that and that. No, there is that one. Okay, let's go and bang that one, right? But at the same time, it's constantly being aware of this, so we don't fall into then this kind of and so many movements fail, by looking at just one thing, one contradiction, and that and this is going to be difficult because we will have to invent as we go some different method of struggling. But I do think we have to make that effort. Otherwise, we're going to fall against, like the main contradiction, and we know that what this was like. So it's a difficult then a kind of action. Of acting, but it's necessary. But it does not take away the urgency. There is a strike to do. There is a strike to do. It's not you're not going to ask this, but as you do the strike, you work through all this long time contradiction, because even if you win that, that's new contradiction going to emerge. So you have constantly to work both in the present and constantly working, nourishing utopian thinking. Where do we want, how we're going to beat that, monster, right? And so there is how we throw things in the machine. So the machine, get to, a rupture, right? The famous strike, the strike, not just in the sense of occupying the place, but how would we stop that? And at the same time, what kind of world we want to do, how we're going to stop the chain, like that, in the different sense of the chain. But when I insist on the multidimensional, because it's hard to intersectionality, the fact that effectively this multiple temporality, this entangled temporality, and the fact that also there are all the things that are making us, and especially now, how do we tackle the question of the environment from a revolutionary point of view? And so we don't so how this is becoming an incredible threat, an important threat, and that how we're going to answer to that from really, and it's in its multi-dimension, right? And how do we And for me, it's how do we look in the abyss of the brutality
sure.
of racial capitalism, and we are not afraid by what we see, but we have to look at it really straight like that, so we can imagine what will has to be done, so that it's not, will be beaten once and for all. And because sometimes I do think that we still think that some reform will happen, or it will reform itself, or it will not go there. And then every day we got proof that yes, they do it. They are absolutely able to do it. They are, as we say in France, born before shame, né avant la honte, they were born before shame arrived in the world, right?
So following up on your decolonial analysis, you provide an example in the book of how you go about constructing a decolonial pedagogy of bananas. And I found that to be a very instructive and very interesting example. And I was just wondering if briefly you would be able to kind of break that down for the listeners so they understand how you go about this analysis.
Okay, very quickly. Years ago, it started during soccer game. The public will throw a banana on the field, and everyone understood it was against the black player. You did not have to say anything. So what was the connection between banana and anti-black racism? That was the beginning, the famous thread. So I pulled the thread, and then appear different history of the banana, the relation with advertisement, the relation with music, with Banana Republic and U.S. imperialism and CIA, consumption, film, and when the connection is made between anti-blackness and the banana. And this will be at the moment when banana become a very U.S. I mean, the U.S. is, importing a lot of banana, intervening in Central America, but also so that the banana has to become something, in every suburb place, right? And at the same time, through that, the advertisement will make the happy, funny, black person or the happy Latina at the moment when imperialism is really, going through that. And so the connection will be made between banana monkey and anti-blackness as a moment, at the same time when the banana become a staple for, on the table, on the US table. And through fun, not, it was, look at it, this is funny, and this, from that, the connection being made, it can effectively become anti-black racism today. So it was to pull all this thread, and today with the pollution, the action of Monsanto, the fact that the banana need to be yellow and in certain shape, otherwise the Western people don't think it's not banana, so they don't want to eat that banana. So all this, you got environment, slavery, imperialism, CIA, black, workers, organization, women, and the question of plantation, where the violence against women is absolutely systemic, advertisement, banana as good food for children, babies, and elderly. So it's like this very banal fruit, that everyone knows. You put in history, which is environmental, imperialism, racism, etc., and they are connected. Not necessarily from, cause to effect, but you trace a certain cartography that suddenly makes sense. And this banal fruit enter in a history and geography that suddenly makes sense, and open your eye to the production, how this come to my table, how this arrive on my table, who put that on my table, and so it's for me also encouraging the curiosity about the world in which we live, which is not natural. The fact that what arrived on my table is not natural. It's not like, it's not some whatever, godly, whatever. So it's also that, and that analysis, constantly asking ourselves where this is coming from, who produces it, how it arrived, what is associated with good health. All this different construction and fabrication make sense, suddenly make visible, as you say, Alyson, a world become visible. And I think by making sense and making all this thread visible, it's less scary, in fact. Because nothing is mysterious at the end, so you get power from knowing that.
Yeah, I think that's really very helpful. It's interesting even thinking about this, drawing on threads of ideas like Marx's secret hidden in the commodity, right? What is all there that we never talk about, and making all of that explicit. Transitioning a little bit, though, one thing that, at least for me, I think stands out about this text, very much so, that I find very helpful, is an emphasis, again, on this idea that decolonial feminism, or a decolonial feminism, rather, would be something that is enacted, right? It's not merely a way of tracing histories or of understanding things. It's something which is done. And I think in the context of thinking through colonization and decoloniality, this is important as well, right? We've had scholars like Tuck and Yang, for example, who've talked about how these things become metaphors that we never move beyond into actual action. And I think what's very profound about this book is the insistence that throughout the Global South, especially, there are women who are enacting struggles that are decolonial feminist struggles. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on what some of those struggles are that have sort of inspired this book, that have sort of drawn you to this project.
Yeah, I will say, indigenous women activists fighting for land, and the connection between land and the body and the health and education. So it's not just I want my piece of land, but how this is connected with, better food for my children, better education, better, and how this understanding of the connection between the different, way of fabricating a vulnerable life, to death or vulnerable life is made. This understanding for me that I see through, indigenous women or Black Afro-Brazilian feminists, or the women in Argentina now, or the incredible courageous women in Mexico who effectively attack the building of power, or what we have seen also in Chile, which I think is very impressive. And even what I thought also was impressive, in terms of practice, as you say, how, during the marches and demonstrations, they understood that, you have the front line, and that front line will be, the people who are not afraid to fight with the police, but those, so there is not, you cannot fight for the police, how, you're poor things, but you are the one in the behind, carrying the water or whatever is need to be carried. And and I do think also this kind of organization is very much closer to what we need, than the kind of heroic things of everyone has to be together, on the same level. And their understanding of that, this feminist in the Global South, is for me absolutely very, very, very strong. As you say, in the action, we imagine, we practice it. So it's not just we should, march, and everyone is put in the march as if everyone is on the same level, for instance, of, fighting. For instance, I run very badly, so don't put me on the front line. Put me in the back, I carry the water, whatever need to be carried, whatever. But don't be, I cannot run, so I'm going to be beaten in the first moment, and then I will no longer. So that also this kind of organization that pay attention, but strongly, to the body and to, the affect and the possibility. And so then work something of a strength, of a force. And that courage can be then enacted. And so it's not kind of masculinistic, kind of macho kind of courage, but it's a deep courage. And I think the feminists understood that, this decolonial feminists in the past, that the fact, and also not being afraid. I think overcoming fear is part of their pedagogy, and I think that's very important, because I do think that the patriarchy now and neoliberalism are very, very good at instilling fear. There is a direct fear of being beaten and killed in the street. But there's all the other fear of, okay, you're going to see what happened to you in terms of job, in terms of housing, in terms also of identifying you as a troublemaker. So your family can even say, what are you doing that? So the kind of pressure of conformity, the constant politics of conformity, and that we have to overcome that. And I do think that these feminists address that very well. The question of fear, the question of conformity, of respectability, and that how to show that they are being weapon in the hand of patriarchy and violence and state violence.
I'm going to stay on the topic of tactics because as individuals on the revolutionary left, we, of course, our entire ideology is based around anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, etc. Everybody that's listening to this already knows that. We also have to figure out tactics for how to take these ideological starting points of anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and apply them to the struggle to build a decolonial feminism. Now, one sticking point that I could see, or something that could be weaponized against us as we are a minority opinion as things stand, is that as you try to build this decolonial feminism in a place like France, for example, that effort in order to overturn the status quo could be weaponized by the state to say, well, this is anti-feminism because you don't want to care about the care work that is allowing these women to achieve their professional goals. You don't care about the women in other countries who are being forced to wear the hijab, etc., etc. You get branded in a way as anti-feminist, as opposed to more accurately being described as a decolonial feminist. So my question for you, Françoise, and Alyson, I'd like to foster a little bit of a back and forth here on the tactical front. So as we go on, we'll just kind of make it more of a conversation. How do we advance our goals of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism in a decolonial feminist framework for success and avoid the pitfalls of being branded as anti-feminist in the process?
That's very important because right now in France, the political anti-racist movement is very fragmented and divided. And neoliberalism is very good at dividing. I mean, divide and rule has always been, of course, the whole tactic of power, and it works. So, they do it. But what I mean is like more what we can notice is like, in the last 2 decades, let's say, the capacity of capitalism of reintegrating what even attack it is much faster than it used to be, right? Much faster. So it's a new, possibility of capitalism. I mean, one day someone says something, the following day you got T-shirt on it, made by women in Thailand and paid, very low, and then sold by whom, online, and then all this will work, right? So effectively, there is a much more difficulty, and the kind of, weaponized as anti-feminist, this is already happening in France. So, so we are accused of, so many things. And so there, I will answer, but if I may. First, I grew up in a anti-colonial communist family, so I know about being insulted, threatened, the notion of rumor. How this also is a weapon that stay. Whatever, there is no veracity. I mean, the truth cannot be said. You say the truth, it does not matter. It will remain. So it's an education. We have to educate ourselves in the fact that we will be insulted, right? We will be defamed and so on. And how do we react like that? How do it does not, affect our mental health? And that's very important because I have seen it so much. I mean, I saw it. I mean, I was 6 years old, and now I'm also the target of that. And I will say, the defense, I mean, the self-defense against weaponization is to understand the role of this and how this is used to weaken you, weaken your autonomy, weaken your courage and force, and how this has succeeded. You got burnout, people cannot stand, they say it's too difficult, I can't do that anymore. So to avoid that, I will say that, and then I will say to understand today this speed through which capitalism is capable of cannibalizing how, for instance, now you got so many capitalists saying we need inclusion, we need diversity, we need more women in business, we need really equality is going to be good. And so I would say there is a shift also, much clearer of perhaps what we saw in the United States under Nixon, of we need, Nixon saying we need black capitalism to beat the Black Panther Party and other, revolutionary party. And we see it reactivated in different way today. The question of corporate philanthropy, which is very important also right now in ways of pacifying, the revolutionary movement. So I will say, to answer more, directly to your question, it's a new political education that we have to develop and deploy. And we have really to go back to what we used to call, or what used to be called political education, really, to give weapon of autonomy, of thinking, and more, because it's very good. I mean, they are very good at what they are doing, and getting much better. They have, like thousands of psychologists, sociologists working for them, say, okay, this, and people. So we should not underestimate their capacity, but also we have to see so many young people, who do not at the same time capable of playing with, what all this social network and doing something else. But I will say, to conclude, that I think we're going to live through difficult moment, that we should not hope for. It's going to be long and difficult. It's not going to be that easy. They are really determined. They are really determined people too. They have an understanding of what the world they want, how they see themselves in that world, and it's not our vision. But they are determined to bring it. Really determined, I think. Sometimes I have to imagine the world they want, because sometimes it's so difficult for me to understand the kind of world they want. But I have to make also this effort of imagination myself to say, okay, this is the world they want, right? And how that world is so different from the world that so many other people. But I have to make this leap sometime, because it's like, who are these people? But but they are there, And the world they want is so strange in a way, very masculinistic. The idea of domination is very important in their worldview, dominating nature, people, everything. And so analysis of domination as a source of action for them, and domination, the god of domination animate them. We should not forget that. Domination is a very important fuel for them. And of course, it may appear foreign to us, but we have to understand that it's not irrational what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. So, Alyson, I know you have a question, but I have just a very brief follow-up here, and I'd like both of your takes on it. So, Alyson, I'll let you answer first, and then you can ask Françoise your question as well, and Françoise can then take both of them in turn. So, Françoise, you just talked about how we have a very different worldview than the people that are trying to uphold the current world that we live in, and we want to construct something totally different. So my question, and Alyson, like I said, I'll pitch it over to you first. It's very, very simple, and I think that your previous answer alluded to how you're going to answer it. Can we construct something approximating a decolonial feminism without first overturning capitalism as a system? Because I think that we can get closer to it, but I'm unsure that we can actually achieve anything that we would consider a true decolonial feminism without actually overturning capitalism as a system, either at the same time or before we actually build this decolonial feminism that we would like to see. So, Alyson, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this question perfectly brings up what I was trying to get at with my question about the multidimensional analysis as well. And isn't this what's so difficult, right? Is to a certain extent, it's not just, I think, that we could not have a decolonial project without the abolition of capitalism, but we also couldn't have the abolition of capitalism without a decolonial project as well, right? And that's sort of, I think, where it's so hard coming as a communist in the 21st century, where we have, I think, found fantastic and incredible theoretical breakthroughs in the last 100 years of development of political theory that allow us to see the interconnection of these. And it does get difficult to decide where to start in terms of these things. So, I don't want to say that like we couldn't have it without getting rid of capitalism, because I think that puts the direction that things need to move in a very linear manner, when these things are both things that have to be combated simultaneously. And that might deal kind of with this question of temporality, right? That is, of course, constantly complicating the political question for us. So it seems to me like, what I find useful in this text, and what I have found useful in decolonial perspectives generally, is an analysis of the way that capitalism and colonization are inherently intertwined with each other. So again, there's, both the original sense of capitalist land expansion, resource acquisition through colonization, but Françoise, like you say, there's also the colonization of bodies as an ongoing project within capitalism in its relation to labor. And so I think I would want to push back against the idea that these are disentangleable in a temporal manner at all, perhaps. It's hard to see the difference between the two to a certain extent. That's kind of how I would approach it, at least. But again, these things are difficult because trying to come from a decolonial feminist perspective, we're dealing with so many layers of exploitation and domination simultaneously that knowing where to begin at all, I think, is difficult. And I would just push against maybe kind of a linear view of this, then this, as a way of approaching that, perhaps.
Totally agree. And Alyson, then what's your question for Françoise? And then we'll let her take both of them.
My question's somewhat in a different direction, but I think relates to this question of domination to a certain extent, and the extent to which, like, there are people who are trying to create this world of the view of the world that is so distinct from our own. And one thing that I found, for a whole discussion here that has been very interesting to think about is in the context of the United States, we had these uprisings last summer that, while not explicitly ideologically decolonial, were uprisings that are spurred by colonial contradictions in the United States, right? We, for example, obviously have the colonial repression of black populations in the United States, which raises questions of histories of colonialism, slavery, all these different sort of complex things that still bear in the present through various things like the prison industrial complex, as well as, the literal stratification of space along colonial lines within US cities. So we saw this kind of come to a head, and I think this idea, Françoise, that you get at of the sort of ability of capitalism to rehabilitate the attacks we make against it is something that we've seen so clearly, right? In the summer of last year, we saw police stations being burned down. We saw what was really a level of intensity in terms of these uprisings that was very profound. And at the same time, we have also seen sort of the neoliberal move to try to placate this. So the Biden presidency, obviously, is full of neoliberal rhetoric that never moves beyond that rhetoric whatsoever. Harris, as a vice president, is used as a tokenized figure, right, in order to kind of push back against these attacks. And so we've seen really this attempt, I think, that neoliberal ideology is so good at, to rehabilitate those events that have occurred. And so that's happening on the one hand. And what I wanted to get at, and I think your book does get at this as well, is on the other hand, while we have this attempt to rehabilitate kind of the rhetoric of resistance, there's also more raw repression that occurs, right? And this is, I think, the other side of what we're seeing in the United States, at least, where the hammer is beginning to fall somewhat. There's increased discussion of domestic violent extremism, right? It's kind of the talk that we are seeing from the federal government that is meant to focus on both the right and the left, obviously. But there's also kind of a revived call for intense crime legislation in the United States, which is hard to see as anything other than a direct kind of reactionary response to these uprisings that occurred. And so my question, which is not super related to the first one, but, you can tackle them how you want, would be, does decolonial feminism give us a way to resist that repressive power as well, not just the rehabilitative power of capital?
Well, many things. I will perhaps start by perhaps a lesson of decolonial feminism that's connected with the analysis of racism and how racism, capitalism are intertwined, and you cannot have anti-racism without anti-capitalism and vice versa. I will say that one lesson that even to perhaps to rethink even the temporality of struggle, even, the vocabulary of defeat and victory, the fact that most revolution movements have been defeated. What do we mean by defeated? Is that are we not adopted also the vocabulary? Kind of long history on which, nonetheless, all the ways and routes that were opened by this preceding struggle, on which we stand, and all what we learn from them, right, and all what we learn from what happened. Though that would be first things. And the question, then the question of repression. I do think that we have not seen the end of it. What's happening also in Lebanon, what's happening, what's happening in Algeria, where you had 1 million people every Friday out, and that the regime now is, jailing everyone, and censorship everywhere. The rise of the far right all through Europe. The fact that you have, a fascist now in the Spanish parliament. You got also Nazi in the German parliament, and people in Hungary and Poland. The government. There is really, you got Brexit and Boris Johnson, and you get Modi in India, who let these people, die. And Bolsonaro in Brazil. We are surrounded. There is a very moment, an incredible, strong reaction that is, and not connected with the image of what you say, that, for instance, the Biden image or Macron image, right now, that if there is still possible hope, bourgeois democratic capitalism, right, and capitalism and racial capitalism. What do we see everywhere is, in fact, the men in power who are absolutely fascist, mad, criminal. Absolutely criminal. So I do think that the question of repression is that we have to say, okay, we are living dark time, and they're going to be darker, right? So the way in which resistance had to be think is on with this understanding and this witness knowledge that we have to learn from the past or from the present ways of protecting ourselves, because they're gonna strike, right? As you say, on the one hand, we have a Black woman as vice president of the United States. On the other hand, more jails and more jails and more jails and more, crazy things. And you do have people in power who are not necessarily that popular, but they are able to stay in power. So there is a crisis of nation, deep have been for a long time, but more than ever. So this is a situation, and it asks for a lot of imagination on our hand. Incredible, also imagination one can be. So what's happening also, I will say also, we have to look at what's happening also in Africa, what's happening in the Caribbean, what's happening in the Pacific, which is really going everywhere, which is at the same time what we did, incredible movement in Thailand. So what is happening now at the same time of incredible emergence of movement everywhere, incredible, and at the same time of incredible repression, at the same time of possibility being absolutely repressed, but with new weapon even, right? Not just the whole police, or jail, but the extension of this weapon, the internalization, the new industry of control and surveillance. That what are we going to do about that? How are we going to fight back? Mm-hmm. So this is why I say we need to have to really rethink how we're going to fight imperialism, capitalism, and racism, and therefore patriarchy, absolutely, with all this aspiration, because I do think that many people in the world understand that this can, if we go on like that, it's death, right? Nothing else. But then what is life? In the sense of revolutionary life, not just living and, in fact, barely breathing, but what is life? And so to bring back also a revolutionary meaning to that. So it's not just social organization, how we're going to have, it's really what is life in the revolutionary sense. What will be life post the kind of life that has been built by this system, which is bare life, not in the sense of Agamben, not that, but barely living, really barely living. I mean, the fact that so many people cannot breathe, and if a human being doesn't breathe, there is not, the fact that water is becoming, less and less available. So I will say, we perhaps as a revolutionary, we have to go back to this absolutely basic need of the human life, see how they are commodified, privatized, and in a way that many people will be deprived of it, and it will still be called life. So how do we redefine life, not in the biological sense only, but life as effectively what will be a full revolutionary life? This has existed. Rosa Luxemburg talked about, the dream of what will be a life that is not determined by racism, sexism, and capitalism. And this, I would say, in recent, this is coming back in indigenous thinking and so on, but for a while, the revolutionary left this aside. What is life? Because by fear of becoming, saying a thing that will look banal, not revolution in the sense of up to the barricade and and the Winter Palace and everything, but in the sense of really that what is life for billions of people in the world, and that this is how to effectively, so children born today will have a childhood already, because childhood is not a universal right. It's not a universal right. So in the way the enslaved fought for freedom, but by saying that freedom is not the freedom the way you have defined it, because the way you have defined it allow for unfreedom, justify unfreedom. So the life the racial capitalism and patriarchy is defining is not life. And so perhaps making that visible as a revolutionary horizon, but having really political meaning to it, not just let's be happy and hold hands, although that could be okay also.
Okay, Françoise, last question now. So Alyson and I, yes, we both do podcasts. Alyson does a philosophy and revolutionary literature podcast. I do a history podcast, but much more important than that is that we're both activists. Most of our listeners are activists, should be. All of our listeners are activists. And if you're listening to this and you're not, get out in the streets and do something, anything. Find something that you believe in and make a noise about it. But, so Françoise, the last question is, for listeners who have listened to this conversation, who are activists or will become activists, what is your take-home message in terms of, from this conversation, both from an analytical standpoint as well as an action-based standpoint? What should activists take from this conversation and from your work more generally to apply to their lives, again, from both analytical and action standpoints?
I will say education, self-education, constantly asking myself questions, and perhaps, what I said 10 years ago need to be revised because, so it's a constant curiosity and openness to, the new contradiction and not being, overwhelmed by that. And the question of really for me, a new form of pedagogy, to invent our own pedagogy, radical pedagogy against, what Paulo Freire or Tagore or Cabral did. We have really, because the question of transmission in a moment when there are so much overload of, whatever happening is very important in terms of, political education, like of being in the world. What does it mean to be in the world, and in the world? So I would say really education.
I think that's a great note to end on. Again, our guest was Françoise Vergès, the author of the new book, A Decolonial Feminism, out from Pluto Press. And I mean this seriously when I say I read a lot, listeners, in case you haven't noticed in past conversations and whatnot. This was one of my favorite books I read this year. It was really tremendous, both, again, from an analytical standpoint as well as just a mind-opening standpoint, because you really gave voice to a lot of things that were kind of floating around in my mind. This wasn't something that was completely alien to me, but I didn't have a very systematized way of thinking about this, and you really gave voice to that. And I want to thank you for putting this work together. And yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. I'm recommending the listeners to pick up the book, request your libraries to get the book. That's something I always say at the end of Guerrilla History episodes. Get libraries to get books. These are important things for everybody to read. So yeah, thank you very much, Françoise Vergès. Can you tell the listeners if there's anywhere that you want to direct them to keep up with you, the work that you're doing, anything of that sort?
Well, I don't like to say, read this book, whatever. It's too, like for me, it's like too scholarly. Be curious, start by something. You can even start by a novel, right? Literature is also very good. Literature, poetry are very good high opener. And then pull the thread to, become like that. I have an upcoming book also in Pluto on the question of, what we allude to, the question of protection. What will be anti-racist politic of protection? So how to bring back, protection in our hands, self-defense and things like that. And also something on colonial violence in the public space. That will be out in France about how cities are hostile environment to women, to gays, to queer, to trans, to workers, to Black, to Arabs, to homeless people, to migrant, to refugee, behind the face of cities for fun and romantic cities and all this behind a very brutal and cruel environment. So the colonial violence are not just a statue and monument, but the way in which the city itself is forbidden is in fact some form of apartheid, segregation.
I'm really looking forward to that future work, the question of protection, and hopefully we'll be able to convince you to come back and talk to us about that when it comes out, because I know I would really enjoy that conversation. Alyson, any final thoughts on your behalf? And can you tell the listeners, particularly Guerrilla History listeners who don't listen to the Red Menace but should, how they can find your work or anything that you want to direct them to as well?
Yeah, so just real quick, thank you so much for having us both on here, Henry. This has been an absolute joy. And thank you, Françoise, so much. This has been an incredible discussion. And thank you for this text. Honestly, it's definitely one I'll be recommending to people and studying, ideally, with others, because I think there's a lot of value here. In terms of Red Menace, you can find us on Twitter. You can find us on most things that podcasts are on. This month, we are actually covering 2 works by Alexandra Kollontai about, kind of women's issues in Russia at the time, her thoughts before the revolution and her thoughts after the revolution, tracing some of the development of those ideas, the social basis of the women question, and her fascinating text, Make Way for Winged Arrows, which I think gets into some of that imaginative work, perhaps, in a way that is quite useful. So that's what we'll be doing this month. You can check it out, again, on iTunes podcast app. I think we're on most of the major stuff. And yeah, if you enjoyed this, hopefully we can have some conversations there that will also be helpful for thinking through these questions.
And on my behalf and Guerrilla History's behalf, you can find me personally on Twitter at Huck1995. That's HUCK1995. If you are a Red Menace listener and don't listen to Guerrilla History, check us out. We're on every podcasting platform app that you pretty much could think of. You can find us on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod. That's GUERR with 2 R's, ILLA. If you look up only 1 R, for some reason, it doesn't show up a lot of the time, even though it should. In any case, it was a wonderful conversation. Really looking forward to hopefully talking with you both again in the relatively near future. And I guess the last thing I'll pitch then is things that are coming out on Guerrilla History, since you just did for Red Menace. Our last episode that came out is an episode with Andrew Liu talking about the development of capitalism in China and India through the story of the tea trade, a story of a commodity as the development of capitalism. Very interesting. We're also releasing one of our Patreon episodes this week. It's going to be on UFOs, so something very out of left field for us, but hopefully something that listeners will have a fun time listening to. We had a very interesting conversation. And our episode for July is going to be on another book from Pluto, which is Organizing Insurgency. I'm pulling it next to me, but I'm making noise doing so. Now I'm dropping stuff. Organizing Insurgency, Workers' Movements in the Global South by Emmanuel Ness. A fantastic book, fantastic conversation. So be sure to check us out, subscribe, all of that. On that note, we're closed for now, listeners. Until next time, solidarity.